Hey guys, I just wanted to make a video here that I've never done before, and I put a poll on my main Instagram page, my personal page, a long time ago, asking my friends basically if they think I could add like a Bible study kind of video to my music page, if that would kind of draw more people in. And they said yeah, and that was like 3 or 4 months ago, so it's been a bit, but I finally got around to it. So today I decided I'm going to be talking about faith, not works, because I've been going through a study of Romans, and I just went back through it again because I didn't think I did a very good job the first time, and this kind of stuck out to me. And if I do decide to continue doing this, then I figured why not just start here and go from there. Alright, so I wrote down a few key points, and those are the following. Righteousness is our reward from God for our faithfulness. And that is in Romans 4, verses 4 through 5. And I can find that right here. And it says, "Now to the one who works, wages are not credited as a gift, but as an obligation. However, to the one who does not work, but trusts God who justifies the ungodly, their faith is credited as righteousness." And so what I got from that is basically for the people who work, wages are required. It's the wages are paid to the person. It's an obligation, and those wages are not a gift. Like if you're working, your job is not going to give you this money as a gift. You actually did something for it. But with the gift of righteousness, when God credits righteousness to us, those who do not work, as they say, which is faith, relying on God, not works, those people are given a gift, which is being credited righteousness. And so that is the foundation of the idea of faith, not works, because we don't need to do different kinds of works in order to be credited with righteousness. It's the idea of grace, which is defined as unmerited favor. Unmerited meaning you don't do anything for it. He gives it to you regardless. And so the second point here is those to whom God credits righteousness, example, those who are faithful, are blessed. And like I said before, people who are faithful are going to be credited with righteousness. And so what this next verse is doing is it takes it a step further and says, all right, if you're being faithful and you're being credited with righteousness, here is what you get in return. And that verse is actually from the Psalms, but Paul writes it here, and he says, right here in verse 6, David says the same thing when he speaks of the blessedness of the one to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord will never count against them. And I wrote a note in there, and I put for verses 4, 7 through, or chapter 4, 7 through verses 7 through 8. That is basically the model of salvation. It's saying whose sins are covered and forgiven, whose sins God will never count against them. That's salvation. And so having faith in that salvation is what gets you credited with righteousness, and then, as David says, blessed. And then the last point here is Abraham, which Paul cites repeatedly because in the time period the Jews were heavily dependent on the Old Testament because that is their Bible per se. That is what they trust in, what they believe in, and the laws they go by. And so they often look to Abraham as the father of their faith, essentially. They look to him for guidance in the laws and basically everything else. But Paul wants to use Abraham, that way the Jews understand what he's talking about, to disprove one of their key claims, which is that you do need to do the works because the law and circumcision at the time of Abraham were both required essentially by the Jews and their customs if you were to be saved and whatnot. But Paul says that that's not the case because Abraham is proof of the faith over works model. He was faithful long before the law and circumcision because, of course, circumcision came with the law. It was a covenant. In other words, remaining faithful to God brings righteousness. Remember, credited as righteousness. The law is not needed, though we still must follow it. And at that last point, you can check out Romans 3:31, because he does say that our faith does not nullify the law. We still have to follow authority. But what he's saying here in chapter 4, verses 10 through 11, is more along the lines of you have to be faithful apart from the law and to the law. because while you don't want to lean entirely on the law like the Jews did, you still have to follow it, but you have to make sure that your number one priority is following God, and then your faith will be credited as righteousness. And so that was verses 4 through 11, or 10 through 11, excuse me. It says, under what circumstances was it credited, referring to Abraham's faith? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before. And he received circumcision as a sign, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So essentially, what they're saying there, what Paul is saying there, is that before the law had even come, because of course Abraham was long before Moses' time, and before circumcision was required, Abraham was still faithful and is counted as righteous, not only by the Jews, but by God himself. And in this way, Paul says, well, if there was no law, then how is it that works is how he got his righteousness? Because you do works by following the law and whatnot, and works are basically outlined in the Bible mostly as being dependent on the law for salvation. And that's what the Jews were for most of this time, because especially after their exile, they were heavily worried that something like this was going to happen again. They were going to have their nation conquered if they didn't stick to the law. And so they basically hammered down on anyone that did not follow the law and started making their own laws, which is where it kind of got off track. But the whole point of what Paul is saying here, the law that was set up, that the Jews followed so strictly, led them away from God in the end, because the way they were looking at it is, we've got to follow the law. We've got to do everything it says, when really their faith should have been in God. And that's the idea of faith over works. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, whichever. This is definitely not a vlog, but I just want to do this as much as I can. It's probably going to be sporadic, but I really enjoy going through, especially the book of Romans. It's one of my favorite books, and Paul is a spectacular writer, and I just want to go through as much as I can and just share this with you, because I feel like through my covers and stuff like that, you don't really get to dive deep into what the message I'm trying to send. So I know this is kind of a long video. Most of them will probably be a lot shorter if I end up releasing a lot more. And hopefully I'll get better as I keep going. I'm currently not very good at this whole talking to a video recorder thing. But thanks for sticking with me, and hopefully we'll be able to do some big things. Peace.